I woke up to an unnatural silence. It wasn't the peaceful, birds chirping kind of silence that usually greeted me in the mornings. No, this was the eerie, something is very wrong kind of silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race before you even know what's happening. I threw off the covers and stumbled to the window, my bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. The sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. My private pond, which usually shimmered under the morning sun, looked like it had been pulled straight out of a horror movie. The water, once crystal clear, was now a murky, bubbling fluorescent green. A sickly chemical stench filled the air, strong enough to make my eyes water. And then I saw them, the fish. Dozens of them, floating belly up, lifeless on the surface. A deep pit formed in my stomach as I took in the full horror of what had happened. Someone had poisoned my pond. I rushed down to the shore, barely processing what I was seeing. The water hissed and fizzled near the edges, the grass turning yellow where the liquid touched it. This wasn't some accident. Someone had deliberately dumped something toxic into my pond. My mind raced through possibilities, but there was really only one person in the neighborhood psychotic enough to do something like this: Margaret Hargrove. Margaret was the self-proclaimed queen of our homeowners association, though most of us just called her the HOA tyrant. She had a permanent scowl, a short, jet-black bob that never moved, and a voice that could shatter glass when she was in full complaint mode. She had waged a personal war against me ever since she realized I was the only homeowner in the community whose property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. The pond, sitting right behind my house, was private property, untouchable by her ridiculous rules. And that fact drove her absolutely insane. For months, she had been trying to bully me into draining it. She claimed it attracted unwanted wildlife, disrupted the uniformity of the neighborhood, and was even a safety hazard because someone might fall in. I had laughed in her face then, but now, standing on my shore, looking at the destruction before me, I wasn't laughing anymore. I stormed back into my house, my heart pounding. I needed proof. Luckily, I had a set of security cameras installed around the perimeter of my property, mostly to keep an eye on my shed. I pulled up the footage from the night before and fast-forwarded through the hours. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., I saw her. Margaret, dressed in her usual pastel blue cardigan and khakis, was hauling massive industrial-sized jugs from the back of her SUV. She struggled with the weight of them, nearly tripping over her own feet as she carried them toward the water. I watched in disbelief as she unscrewed the lids one by one and dumped their contents straight into my pond. She worked quickly, nervously glancing around like some cartoon villain. And then, after she was done, she wiped her hands on her pants, admired her work, and actually smiled before walking back to her car. I rewound the footage, making sure I wasn't hallucinating. But no, there it was, in full high-definition clarity. Margaret had poisoned my pond, and she had done it with the enthusiasm of a woman who thought she had just done the neighborhood a favor. A mixture of rage and disbelief settled in my chest. Who does this? What kind of person wakes up one morning and thinks, you know what? Let me commit a federal crime just because I don't like a body of water. I clenched my fists, my mind racing through options. Confronting her would be too easy. She'd deny everything, probably try to play the victim. No, I needed something bigger, something she couldn't talk her way out of. That's when it hit me, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. If there was one organization that took illegal dumping and water contamination seriously, it was the EPA. And judging by the state of my pond, Margaret hadn't just tossed in some weed killer. She had used industrial-grade chemicals. I grabbed my phone and did a quick search. Sure enough, the EPA had an emergency hotline for environmental violations. With a smirk, I hit the call button. A voice answered almost immediately. EPA Enforcement Division. What's your emergency? I took a deep breath. Yeah, hi. I think my neighbor just committed an environmental crime. There was a pause. Can you clarify, sir? Oh, I can do better than that. I have video evidence, and let's just say it's bad. The agent asked for details, and I laid it all out. Margaret sneaking onto my property, dumping unknown chemicals into my pond, the aftermath. I described the water's unnatural color, the dead fish, the toxic fumes. As I spoke, I could hear the agent typing furiously on their end. This is serious, they finally said. We're dispatching a field team to your location. Do not attempt to clean or remove anything from the area. I grinned. Oh, don't worry. I wouldn't dream of it. After hanging up, I sat back and exhaled. This was going to be good. Margaret had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, slapping people with fines for leaving their trash cans out an extra hour, demanding they repaint their houses for the smallest infractions. But this time, she had gone too far. She wasn't dealing with an HOA complaint now. She was dealing with the federal government. I spent the rest of the morning making sure the footage was backed up in multiple places. I even sent a copy to my lawyer, just in case Margaret tried any legal nonsense. By noon, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy vehicles pulling up to my driveway. Peeking through my window, I saw them, 2 black SUVs with government plates. Men and women in suits stepped out, serious expressions on their faces, carrying equipment and testing kits. The EPA had arrived, and Margaret, oh, she had no idea what was coming for her. The first sign that Margaret was about to have the worst day of her life was the arrival of the EPA. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled up my driveway, their engines humming with quiet authority. The doors opened in perfect sync, and out stepped 3 agents in dark suits, their faces set in professional indifference. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes and a clipboard, scanned the property before stepping forward. I leaned against my porch railing, sipping my coffee like it was just another peaceful morning. In reality, my heart was pounding with excitement. This was the kind of moment you didn't just live through, you savored it. The agent introduced himself as Agent Carter from the Environmental Protection Agency's Enforcement Division. His no-nonsense tone told me he had seen things like this before, but the way his brow furrowed as he took in the pond told me he had never quite seen something this blatant. I led them to the shore, where the water was still that sickly green, bubbling at the edges like a toxic stew. The stench of chemicals was even worse now, thick in the air, making my nose burn. The agents pulled out their equipment, sampling kits, pH testers, a clipboard filled with checklists that made my heart sing. They were thorough, dipping vials into the water, writing down notes, and exchanging looks that told me this was far worse than a simple case of overenthusiastic weed killing. One of them knelt down, scooped up a small amount of pond water, and swirled it in the vial. He held it up to the light, frowning. "This isn't just herbicide," he said, his voice laced with something between concern and disbelief. "This is industrial-grade contamination. Some of these chemicals aren't even supposed to be available to the public." That got my attention. My smirk faded just a little. "So what does that mean?" I asked, watching their reactions carefully. "It means," Carter said, standing up and dusting off his knees, "whoever dumped this didn't just break some local ordinance. They violated federal environmental laws. This could be classified as an act of ecological sabotage." My stomach did a little backflip of delight. Margaret was so finished. Before I could enjoy the moment too much, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Across the street, behind the perfectly trimmed hedge of her front yard, was Margaret herself, peeking out like some kind of nosy sitcom character. She was gripping a coffee mug, her knuckles white, her face frozen in shock as she watched the scene unfold. I made eye contact with her and lifted my mug in a mock toast. Her face drained of color. She must have realized that whatever she had done, it had escalated far beyond the petty HOA disputes she was used to. Margaret, however, wasn't the type to back down gracefully. Instead of running and hiding like a sensible person, she stormed out of her house, her cardigan flapping behind her as she marched across the street toward us. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice a little too shrill to sound casual. "Why are there government agents on private property?" Agent Carter barely spared her a glance. "EPA business, ma'am. This is an active environmental crime scene." Margaret let out a forced little laugh, the kind people make when they're trying to sound unbothered but are actually on the verge of a meltdown. "Oh, come on," she said, her eyes darting between me and the agents. "This is ridiculous. It's just a little weed killer. I was only trying to help." That did it. The agents turned to her in unison, their professional poker faces cracking just enough to show their disbelief. Carter flipped open his clipboard. "Ma'am, are you admitting to dumping chemicals into this pond?" Margaret froze for a split second, her face twisted into something resembling panic before she composed herself. Well, I mean, it's not like it was harmful. The pond was an eyesore. Everyone in the neighborhood wanted it gone. I was doing a community service. Carter exchanged a look with his partner, then pulled out a notepad. Ma'am, are you aware that you have committed multiple violations of the Clean Water Act? That contaminating a natural water source, even a private one, is a federal offense? That the substances detected in this water are classified as hazardous under environmental protection laws. Margaret's fake confidence wavered. Now, hold on just a minute. I decided to help. I decided to help her out. Oh, don't worry, Margaret. I've got the security footage of you doing your little midnight science experiment. I made sure to send copies to my lawyer too, just in case you felt like denying it. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned back to Carter. This is absurd. He's lying. He's always been against the HOA. Carter pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen a few times. I had already sent them the footage earlier that morning, and now Margaret got to watch herself on screen, pouring gallons of illegal chemicals into the pond with all the subtlety of a cartoon villain. The color drained from her face entirely. This is taken out of context, she tried, her voice climbing several octaves. Carter sighed and snapped his clipboard shut. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning. That was when the panic truly set in. You can't do this, she shrieked. I have rights. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. Carter, unbothered, motioned to his partner, who pulled out an official-looking document. Actually, ma'am, you have the right to legal representation. But based on what we're seeing here, you're looking at some serious fines, potential criminal charges, and if the contamination is severe enough, mandatory environmental rehabilitation. Margaret started hyperventilating. You can't arrest me for this. It's just water. He's being dramatic. Look at him, standing there all smug. She jabbed a finger in my direction, but I just shrugged. Hey, Margaret, remember all those times you fined people for not keeping their grass short enough? Consider this karma. The EPA agents escorted her toward the SUVs, and for the first time in her life, Margaret didn't have the upper hand. She had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood, acting like a dictator, but today, she was just another citizen facing the consequences of her actions. As they drove away, I let out a long, satisfied breath. The pond still looked like a disaster zone, but at least justice had been set in motion. I turned back toward my house, already planning my next move. This wasn't over yet. Margaret had only just begun to understand what it meant to mess with the wrong person. And when the neighborhood found out what had happened, things were about to get even more interesting. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than a wildfire. By the time Margaret's SUV disappeared down the street with the EPA agents, people were already whispering on their porches, peeking through blinds, and texting their friends. The mighty Margaret Hargrove, the iron-fisted queen of the HOA, had just been hauled off for questioning by the federal government. The news hit the community like a bomb, and for the first time in years, people were excited about an HOA meeting. Later that evening, the emergency HOA gathering was packed. Residents who usually couldn't be bothered to show up were now sitting shoulder to shoulder, whispering and buzzing with barely contained glee. The HOA board, now leaderless, looked like a ship lost at sea. Margaret had always been the one pulling the strings, enforcing fines, and making everyone's life miserable. Now, with her future uncertain, people were realizing just how much they despised her reign. The vice president of the HOA, a nervous man named Greg who always seemed terrified of Margaret, cleared his throat and tried to call the meeting to order. We need to discuss the situation regarding Miss Hargrove, he began, his voice cracking under the weight of dozens of amused and eager stares. Given the recent events, it seems prudent to take a vote on her position as HOA president. Someone in the back called out, "Throw her out," and the entire room erupted into agreement. Greg held up his hands in an attempt to regain control, but the decision was already made. Margaret had spent years making enemies, and now that she was vulnerable, nobody was willing to defend her. A motion was made, a vote was held, and within 10 minutes, Margaret was officially removed as HOA president. The room burst into applause. I watched the whole thing unfold from the back of the room, arms crossed, sipping from a water bottle like I was watching the best reality TV show of the decade. Margaret hadn't just lost her position, she had lost her power. Without the HOA to hide behind, she was just another homeowner. And after what she had done, nobody was going to treat her with the same fearful deference they once had. 2 days later, the EPA released an official statement confirming that the chemicals dumped into my pond were classified as hazardous waste. The cleanup process would take weeks, and the fines would be astronomical. And the best part? Margaret was personally liable. Her argument that she was helping the community didn't hold up when confronted with federal environmental laws. The HOA wasn't responsible for her actions, which meant every dollar of the cleanup and the penalties would come straight out of Margaret's own pocket. I made sure to be outside when she returned home. She stepped out of her car, looking 10 years older than she had when this all started. Her usual smug expression was replaced with exhaustion and desperation. She saw me sitting on my porch and hesitated before marching toward her house with forced dignity. "Welcome back," I said, sipping my coffee. She shot me a glare, but didn't respond. It was clear she had been humbled, but not enough to admit she was wrong. Over the next week, she avoided everyone. Normally, Margaret strutted through the neighborhood like a queen overseeing her subjects, but now she was a ghost. Whenever she went outside, people stared. Some whispered. A few even laughed. Her downfall had become the neighborhood's favorite topic of conversation. But the best moment came when the EPA workers arrived to begin the cleanup. They set up their equipment, unloaded hazardous waste disposal materials, and then, much to my delight, called Margaret over. She stomped across the lawn, looking as if she was about to demand they leave, but the lead EPA agent handed her a clipboard and pointed at a section of the cleanup area. "As part of your settlement agreement, you'll be assisting in the remediation process," he explained. "This is a supervised cleanup, and failure to comply could lead to additional legal action." I nearly choked on my drink. Margaret, the same woman who had fined people for not trimming their hedges evenly, was now legally obligated to clean up the mess she had created. And she couldn't refuse. She stood there, frozen, as the weight of it all finally seemed to hit her. Then, without another word, she took the gloves and protective suit they handed her and got to work. It was a sight to behold. Margaret, who had once treated the entire neighborhood like her personal kingdom, was now knee-deep in the toxic pond she had poisoned, scooping out dead fish and contaminated debris. EPA workers supervised her, making sure she followed protocol, and every now and then, I would hear her muttering under her breath, probably cursing my existence. I made sure to document the moment. A few pictures, a short video, nothing too invasive, just enough to capture history in the making. And then, just because I couldn't resist, I uploaded a short clip online with the title, "HOA Tyrant Finally Cleans Up Her Act." It went viral almost instantly. The comments were relentless. People who had never even heard of our neighborhood suddenly had opinions on Margaret. Some called her the HOA dictator, others, the pond poisoner. Memes were made. It was glorious. Margaret, of course, tried to play the victim. She claimed the whole thing was blown out of proportion, that she was unfairly targeted. But nobody bought it. The EPA didn't arrest people over misunderstandings. Within a month, the pond was mostly restored, but the damage to Margaret's reputation was permanent. The HOA continued on without her, making much-needed changes to the ridiculous rules she had once enforced. People started enjoying their homes again without fear of her ridiculous fines. The community had never been more united in their collective joy of watching her fall. And Margaret? She didn't last long. The combination of the fines, the legal fees, and the humiliation proved too much for her. One day, without warning, a for sale sign appeared on her front lawn. A few weeks later, a moving truck pulled up, and Margaret, her face hard with anger and defeat, packed up and left without saying a word to anyone. People gathered to watch her go, waving her off with the kind of smiles you only see when justice has been served. I stood by my pond, now clear and healthy again, watching as her car disappeared down the street. There was no grand confrontation, no final words exchanged, just a simple, quiet end to her reign of terror. As the sun set over the water, I took a deep breath and smiled. The pond was mine again. The neighborhood was finally free. And best of all, I would never have to hear Margaret Hargrove's voice ever again. Justice had never felt so sweet. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.